The bus was a sluggish, aging leviathan, its shocks groaning a tired rhythm with every shift in the weight of the passengers. It was the mid-afternoon, the type of time when the day was halfway through melting itself. Sun bleated and blinked through grimy, smeared windows, casting long bars of pale light through the space and laying itself over every passenger. There was a peculiar humidity, the type that gathered close like a damp, smothering blanket and soaked into everyone's clothes and mood. The vehicle groaned to a halt at a stop marked only by the faded peeling paint on a sign that had been swallowed, bit, by overgrown bushes. Passengers began the slow, weary dance that came with a public transportation exchange. A few weary souls dismounted, shoulders slumped, as fresh blood joined the stagnant air within. Among them was a man who seemed, at first glance, quite unremarkable. Tall, lean with well-earned scars carved across his forehead, dark eyes the color of faded obsidian that looked upon everything without revealing too much. His military background sat on his body the same as the uniform once did. Solid but gentle and unassuming, even the neatly pressed clothes and clean white cap couldn't seem to hide that quiet calm of a soldier at rest. It had been there as he calmly stepped onto the bus, moving into one of the back empty window seats without disturbing anyone else's day. He adjusted himself and rested his tired back against the hard plastic shell. A weary exhale passed between his teeth as he pulled out an aged book from the backpack lying across his lap. Its cover faded and soft, and its edges ruffled as the pages flipped under his fingers to his reading place. He adjusted his glasses and settled into his routine of transit escape, his awareness dimming as the stories came alive for him. That was before the woman. She arrived in a flurry of frustrated energy as she seemed almost blown by the gentle breeze through the doors. It was impossible to not notice her, as her tight face was scrunched in perpetual disdain, thin lips perpetually drawn into a hard line. Her hair was stiff, dyed a garish shade of honey blonde, its short strands barely containing its rage-induced tension. She stomped up the 3 steps, as each step seemed a drumbeat of silent, growing ire. She was an aging blonde woman of around late middle-aged or early senior years with tight facial muscles, which showed she clearly had little interest in hiding whatever was crawling under her wrinkled skin, or had likely gone as long as humanly possible, attempting not to before it finally burst through all those barriers of polite respect. Her blouse was a white lace top, already wrinkled and clinging awkwardly over a tight belly which bulged in a slightly odd round way as she moved past the first few rows toward a slightly more sparse gathering in the back half. It wasn't the look of pure hate or anger. It was far, far worse than either of those fleeting expressions. It was something far colder, more insidious. Disdain would be a too light of a word. Hatred barely scratched the surface, really. It was closer to disgust, like seeing something under a rock in the heat, or a soiled bandage discarded in public. And its heat rose up off her like swamp gas. She found her seat as the same tired rhythm as the other passengers as the bus started forward, lurching in an aggressive forward roll that seemed to send an earthquake straight up from her feet. But she was an expert in ignoring both. She could simply settle her full weight down in a heavy, huffed fashion. Her eyes did, however, land and rest with disturbing intention onto the black veteran in the seat next to her. His quiet, reading calm now directly under that putrid inspection. He barely blinked, his dark eyes scanning the printed page in his aged book, doing his best not to take any real interest in the unwanted scrutiny or in anything or anyone nearby. That must have stung like a slap across the face because suddenly her hard features turned from indifference into something far more dangerous. Something the other passengers suddenly all recognized and went as still as their bones could possibly allow. It was the sound, a slight shift of the skin, the almost invisible movement, beneath, behind, and over the tightened muscles that were making it harder to disguise this rage that came in a deep-throated growl from the old woman beside him. "Move!" she grunted, the word less a request and more a dismissal. Her fingers curled in preparation, resting heavily against her legs, muscles tightened at her waist. The tension grew and gathered until it filled the small spaces like something wet and rotten in all the quiet places where air normally flowed between passengers. He glanced at the woman out of the periphery, and a tiny, almost invisible flicker seemed to be happening at the corner of his tight lips. But the man remained seated, undisturbed, turning another page with almost unnerving calm. Her eyes flared wide at this quiet act. She felt that unshifting, calm power rise inside her until all reason ceased. It had the sound of something shattering on the inside of her. She repeated it louder, the air almost visibly thicker with it. "I said move! Now!" The veteran looked at her this time, meeting her poisonous gaze with dark placidness. It took very long seconds to gather, as everyone seemed frozen to their respective seats. But the silence gave the sound far more bite and impact as his deep voice seemed to carry a natural authority which no amount of anger, yelling, and rage can equal or measure up to. The calm delivery was simply unmatchable. "Ma'am," his voice rumbled, his hands folded upon the book laying in his lap. His voice was neutral, but the way he spoke every single letter carried, despite their gentle cadence, every inch of his training. No panic or visible emotion in that perfect and still voice. He continued in a quiet tone, and for a second she seemed frozen, her mouth half open at the sound. His voice seemed too heavy and grounded for a man his size. "There are many seats on the bus that I'm sure could suit your desires much better. If that's not acceptable for you, I have already found this one suitable to myself, and I have no intention of moving." The subtle lilt to his words were a deep South draw, and that made her all the angrier, and that hate poured out of her. She sputtered at that as all logic had ceased a while back with all reason, and she was now drowning in only the dark pools of whatever madness lay hidden just behind her hard mask. "Don't you get lippy with me, boy," she spat, and the use of boy rolled off her tongue in the way a rancid, wet, soggy something will. "You should have all died for all we all care. It's all just for you naggers that those soldiers died fighting. All them real American boys who are out protecting this place from scum like you." Her face had warped and flushed from her words, which grew in pitch. She looked ready to combust right there, as more ugly language boiled over into a long stream. It seemed a floodgate of venom had simply given way to this tide, and that quiet calm on the side of the bus simply turned up into something harder to even notice. She grew even louder to catch more attention in the process. She didn't need to, though. It was done now. The entire bus had been pulled into her orbit of malice, not able to not bear witness to what would likely be something that would replay behind each their eyes long into the coming years. They could already feel it setting up camp deep into each of their own systems, a silent trespass of rage and the complete inability to do, or say, a thing. As silent, paralyzed spectators as this small show slowly unfolded. "All that naggers are worth a hill of shit." She'd lost any pretense to even any level of decency now as more words poured over her tightened lips, and her eyes went around in something close to what most call crazy, her cheeks a furious, dangerous shade of plum. "Always bitchin', always trying to ruin a real American. Thinking you're special. You're no more worth than the shoes I spit on." She punctuated with more spittle and more hateful spit, which continued for what felt like an impossibly long stretch of time. She continued to insult his family, his culture, his history. She tried everything she could possibly imagine, and every new low was found in seconds before another seemed to form somewhere along her mouth as a fresh new assault. She left nothing hidden and no intention unturned as she hurled the entire dark side of American history as her arsenal to this singular attack on one black veteran who simply wished to finish a chapter before exiting off the vehicle on a corner block to a destination no one knew of. He continued to stay sitting perfectly still, as this all came like some horrid acid raining upon him, slowly wearing and dripping on his silent presence, with each word thrown in anger from a deep-rooted hatred which ran like a poison through every sinew of her system. It wasn't his reaction. What had everyone transfixed to their places wasn't even for a split second the silent black man sitting there unmoving under this terrible storm. But something deeper was moving beneath, under, and above what her own horrid tirade had stirred into that already muggy, wet space of stale air. As those hard, hateful sounds crashed down like tidal waves over the soldier, another kind of tension had built up at the same time. the two growing and strengthening with each word thrown out with more force and velocity than the one previous. They swirled as each new insult formed into existence somewhere under and beside this heavy silence. Another layer and shade began to show all around her, as if everyone else was waking up together at once, their senses and minds clicking into another rhythm all around the central point of pure black hate. No one single reaction of shock or sadness would have had that sort of heavy silence around and between it all. Yet what was occurring in that public bus wasn't so singular in itself, because there were the collective responses, something very real and potent that everyone had seen and also felt together all at the same time. Everyone now breathing within this very space had simply had enough. Their faces started showing the same heavy disdain as their blood slowly began to bubble together. And with the silence broken only by the sounds of hatred coming out of that vile person's mouth, what everyone had realized slowly was their own bubbling rage against her was, in fact, becoming very loud indeed. The air buzzed like an overused fuse box just ready to go off at a moment's notice. It seemed the bus had taken in every vile sound, stored it, and slowly started to react as a singular force to be reckoned with. It was starting to rise as the tension turned a few degrees more hot and tight in their collective hearts. It took far longer than expected before even a child looked ready to puke, her fists balling tightly around the plastic of her doll's arm with little angry fingers, and all while staring up at the angry face of this white lady who had turned into something far less human over her slow stream of hate and poison she poured all around. A couple slowly started to stand up, faces turning darker at what was coming from her. With the new shade in the red of their flushed skin, fists beginning to slowly coil and clench all around the stale space inside the public transport. A man started to step slowly into the aisle, and a young man not long out of his teens did as well, eyes blazing, no longer so indifferent as his body started to show signs of physical readiness. It was only at that slow-burning boil, as a simmering collective reaction had risen and expanded like heat from boiling tar did. It was the moment the black man started moving at last. His hand rose slowly up, almost in gentle slow motion. The motion cut through and past the thick layer of anger and hatred to finally find a solid purchase. In those silent motions, a fresh space seemed to appear out of the thin and stagnant space, one small pocket to hold the sound in, as it all gathered momentum slowly in and under his arm. And in that perfect quiet that was not broken until now, his big hands opened wide, turned slightly in the direction of his attacker. The tips of his soft fingertips were almost touching her small wrinkled skin. A movement no more fast or furious, only simply there. He held the space in silence like some sort of strange, heavy presence, and she was staring up at the tall man in her blind fury, her own spit and spittle drying to a nasty crust around her tightly formed lips. Then the doors opened in the middle of her final, spittle-filled tirade, her hands finally shaking in fury before slamming heavily onto his hands to move them out of the way and stepping straight out into the bright day without saying a word to anyone at all. She was gone. The doors swung shut again. There were small gasps of surprise and awe and horror all at once all over the public vehicle, and people sat back into their seats, confused and shaken by what had happened as the big vehicle moved sluggishly onward. The quiet, once more settling back down into those worn seats as people slowly tried to make some kind of sense of the chaos which had visited that quiet afternoon. A couple of those hands unclenched. The tension slowly eased, and then it just disappeared altogether with the motion and forward propulsion, back into the small town street and slowly turning and grinding on its set way to nowhere in particular, for too many on those seats in that one space. The child let go of the doll at the same time and began a fresh round of chatter about something small and sweet, something entirely and wonderfully free from the previous awful darkness that had settled just there moments before, and all seemed to be almost, nearly all gone. All that could really only be described, at least until that moment, was simply gone. Or perhaps not. He slowly, quietly turned the page of his worn-out book as he made some small mark, as he'd always done, never acknowledging one moment he wasn't reading. And still he sits with this unknown silence, hovering like dust and dried hate lingering over every space and corner. It is only now that he slowly sits forward, leans his heavy forearms against his heavy and weary knees, and from his deep place behind his thick black brows, watches something coming directly toward him that no one else on the vehicle could notice at all. Where he saw that something new, we may, all of us, may never actually know at all. The bus lumbered on, the rhythm of its movement slowly settling the unease within. The collective held breath was finally exhaled as a soft sigh spread across all, even to those furthest from him, and it passed without comment through that public space. Conversation slowly resumed at half the speed, the odd whisper at twice the loudness, as something real slowly and silently made its way under that veneer of public normalcy. A heavy curtain of shared unease and confused awkwardness started to settle slowly into every space and surface. Most stared blindly ahead as though trying to catch a forgotten face in the dim reflective glass. The odd cough punctuated and pushed against all those uncomfortable quiet pockets that were suddenly far too numerous and dense with their absence. The young child resumed her soft chatter to her doll about a world of small and manageable things, and even those seemed too fast, sharp, and urgent, and not able to settle like it was once. Everyone shifted and swiveled uncomfortably in their seats, and seemed somehow too big for these now too tight and small places. Something within had clearly changed. He, on the other hand, didn't seem so aware at all as those long forearms rested against his tired knees and a heavy brow furrowed under a mess of graying short hair. And there, right across the row of hard gray plastic seats, was someone watching him, directly, intently. His head barely moved from the fixed point outside his vision, somewhere along the side road. Something on its shoulder or side, perhaps. Maybe it wasn't, in the final calculation. He focused intensely in its general area of the passing space, but seemed more intent on the feeling than anything, as he kept his calm, dark gaze locked, still unshifting from that specific invisible spot on that public route which slowly drew it toward. It could, as so many often could be described, also only simply be nothing. Only the passing landscape seen at angles he had been unaware of just seconds prior, when there had been an endless well of terrible hate flowing like a foul river in between all. And it just may be what it was. This, a nothing that slowly grew and grew out of him as he watched. The bus brakes gave an unexpected short jolt as it slowed, lurching forward as the familiar automatic robotic monotone drone announced, "Next stop, Elm Street. Elm Street next. Approaching now." It was a voice that often went without acknowledgement or interest. But not for those watching, nor for the man sitting upright who continued watching with deep placid intent that unknown, silent nothing, which was still somewhere just out there for all. There, moving slowly and quietly along his gaze line to some strange faraway endpoint, not visible for all, at all. He finally seemed ready. His jaw finally began to unhinge from its held position at some old angle, slowly drawing forward. It seemed his silent meditation had slowly drawn a very specific, very precise conclusion, and it had slowly shifted everything into his calm intent. The sound so subtle that only he could recognize it at all. But it is still something very real as it settled onto him from that strange space across those gray plastic seatings of a public bus, somewhere near and far, there and somewhere that can't, will never actually be located nor spoken into all at the same time. So there, it just seemed, simply, to exist for only those two, with a small, quiet knowing settling all over and around all, within this old bus with all those worn surfaces. And even it would slowly begin, finally to feel the subtle shift. It was the air there, so heavy and somehow lighter too, and even, only just possibly. Something fresh started slowly rising up from within them both, and it didn't smell as that prior event, and was somehow something close to right. His posture shifted. He stood up in an impossibly long and silent move as each muscle had come loose from what held it stiff. Then he reached up as those thick dark fingers grasped at the pull string above and pressed on a yellow worn-out light, and the next mechanical announcement played slowly with the old system. Bus stopping. Requested. Bus stopping. And as all on the old transport did a double look out of what could and maybe should have taken notice. A single beat as each passenger went stiff for a beat too long before turning to focus on a dark, weary face and long, slow-motion body moving with an easy fluidity through all. He moved like nothing at all was moving against him to do so, as they all began, slowly, silently watching too. As they seemed to have been trained to do that exact moment as a single unit, they started turning one single heavy-hearted head at what could have been the slow movements and unblinking presence that came now out and across in some silent new light as this man made his final way off into it. The vehicle doors made that same automatic sigh as those long, lean legs walked past those automatic motions without any acknowledgement of it all, and each weary head was locked and placed onto that single act of that one singular and lonely soldier, as that dark, tall silhouette stepped from within all, to disappear in its all-encompassing entirety out onto the busy street without anyone single. Look back. And as each soul tried to settle with their small breath into their small lives and routines, the world slowly returned and they started looking back over the place he left so vacant and completely, strangely silent once he'd finally gone. All of what was seen wasn't really seen or remembered either, as it seemed all was simply gone in the process of what had happened and what he'd left right there beside all that lingering hatred too, just exactly behind everything, all at the same exact moment at once. What all realized too was that they were just a moment away from the very beginning, before any of it had actually started. Yet somehow they could feel it wasn't exactly the same either. Not exactly so. Yet almost, just perhaps only, almost,